So I bet a large handful of you probably remember that my first ever countdown, released 5 years ago as of this month, was top 10 worst video game villains. And as to be expected from someone's first countdown, especially from 2011, it wasn't too great. And by wasn't too great, I mean utter crap. So because it's now been 5 years since I started these shenanigans, and also to celebrate the 25,000 subscriber milestone, again, I've decided to do a fresher take on the topic, hopefully with different results. Many things can come into play with what I consider a bad villain, including lack of memorability, lack of any real threateningness, or sometimes just being shoehorned into a story and suffering for it. You'll be seeing plenty of all three of these things as the list goes on. However, because I honestly couldn't think of enough notably bad villains from games I've played, I've decided to make this just a top 5 as opposed to a top 10. I know the original list was a top 10, but a lot of those candidates I wouldn't say are notably bad enough to make a comeback on this list. Also, giving a heads up now that there may be some spoilers popping up throughout the duration of this video, so you've got your warning. Now then, no more time shall be wasted. Let us commence! Out of all the villain archetypes that exist, one of my least favorite is the big baddie who shows up pretty much last minute for the sake of a final battle. Emphasis on the last minute part, because I have nothing wrong with a higher power entering the conflict. In fact, in some cases, it can be really effective. However, if this new villain steps in too late into the story, then chances are there won't be enough time to flesh out the character. And this is the key issue with Demise in The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Granted, this case is a bit different from most last-minute villains, as prior to his appearance, we knew of his existence. He's talked about in the game's opening cutscene, the game's more prominent villain Girahim makes it clear right at the gate that he's out to resurrect Demise, and you even fight Demise in his imprisoned form. 3 times. However, each time the imprisoned manages to get out, it only takes Link a few minutes before he's right back into the ground, so it's not like he has much of a chance to do anything. But wait, Girahim finally manages to return his master to his original form at the end of the game. So what does Demise do then? Well, he goes to some water world that looks like the place you fought Dark Link in Ocarina of Time, and then you fight him in a battle that makes you wish you were fighting Dark Link in Ocarina of Time because he goes down in a matter of minutes. Good. Like I said, this is my problem with last-minute villains like this. They're never given time to be made interesting. Demise is even given 3 separate monologues, and all 3 of them are generic big baddie final boss talk with really nothing interesting, outside of him implying after his defeat that he's going to reincarnate into Ganondorf and several other Zelda villains further down the timeline. Though what I think makes Demise even less effective as a villain is when you compare him to his underling Girahim, who had been in control of the spotlight for pretty much the entire game until Demise's resurrection, and to put it simply, Girahim's way more interesting than Demise. And considering Girahim puts up much more of a fight than his master, I'm starting to wonder why he didn't just lead the Demon Lord's forces himself instead of relying on the Super Saiyan 3 haired Akuma lookalike. Okay, all joking aside, Demise's design is actually pretty cool. There's a lot of things to look forward to when a new generation of Pokemon starts up. New region to explore, new Pokemon to capture, and new faces to interact with and fight against. But one element of the generations that's slowly but surely becoming more prominent with each new game is the villainous teams. When Pokemon first started, Team Rocket was a simple criminal organization that you had a few run-ins with during the game, but with each generation, the villainous teams became more fleshed out and complex with their identities and schemes. However, with Pokemon starting to put more of a focus on the story elements with the more recent generations, it's become apparent that they can't really effortlessly put together a team of antagonists anymore, something very clearly proven by Team Flare in X and Y. One of the biggest problems with Team Flare is that they really lack a sense of memorability. Literally every other team in the series has had plenty to remember them by, whether it be their commander, their admins, their plans, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the closest Team Flare has something too memorable, aside from their battle themes, is their leader, Lysander. But even then, I'd argue that's more because of his design, not his character or plans. In fact, what exactly was their plan again? Something about making the world more beautiful or something like that? Look, I get there was this whole theme of style and beauty in X and Y with the France-inspired setting and all, but this is a little ridiculous. Okay, in all seriousness, while the Team Flare grunts, admins, and scientists preach about making the world beautiful again, Lysander's plan is actually to cause mass genocide, both to humans and Pokemon mind you, because he thinks human progress is doing nothing but ruining the planet, and wants to remove the world of selfish humans and the tools they use to cause harm, those being Pokemon. At least he's being consistent with his genocide? So in other words, Lysander's basically the human incarnation of an environmentalist film, while his team consists of fashion freaks who I can only describe as incompetent. And we were supposed to take these guys seriously. And like I said earlier, Team Flare is completely void of memorability, which is an absolute problem. The Team Flare admins don't even have names, and I challenge you to name all 5 of the Team Flare scientists without looking it up. Sonic the Hedgehog is a series that honestly baffles me when it comes to its villains. Because on one hand, you've got Dr. Eggman, who's honestly one of the best villains that gaming's had to offer. He can very easily be threatening and get the job done prior to being thwarted by Sonic, but he also has plenty of, well, character to him. He's by far the most fleshed out villain this series has to offer. Meanwhile, the rest of the franchise's villain lineup is filled up with some very forgettable and generally uninteresting foes. Not saying this is the case with all of them. Despite not being physically there for the entire game, I do like Professor Gerald's role as the antagonist in Sonic Adventure 2. Metal Sonic also got more interesting as time went on, especially when he took the role of antagonist in Sonic Heroes. I also like the more unique take they did with Merlina as the villain in Sonic and the Black Knight. And while having some flaws in his plans, I even find Mephiles in Sonic 06 kind of fascinating as a villain. But then you've got villains like Black Doom, the Deadly Six, Eraser Jin, Eggman Nega, Imperator Ix, and you're starting to see what I'm getting at? But even with all these unmemorable enemies Sonic's gone up against, one, in my opinion, stands high above the rest, and I have a feeling a lot of you know exactly who I'm talking about. Now, I'll start by giving credit where credit's due, because admittedly, there are a few positives I can give to Lyric, but even then, that's really in the backstory department. He was part of an ancient civilization and got himself terminally ill from researching powerful crystals, and when the other ancients were unable to heal him, he resorted to technology to be able to keep himself alive, creating his mindset towards technology being the means to thrive, and convincing him to go through this plan of exterminating all organic life on the planet and making a world of metal. Again, it's admittedly a pretty interesting backstory, but that's where the good stuff with Lyric ends. The problem is that, despite being in the game's title and also constantly being talked about as this big scary threat, Lyric barely does anything in the entire game. His only notable action is when he ambushes Sonic and has his henchmen all shoot him at point blank. Except Sonic survives this. It's not even a temporary death like in Sonic 06, it just straight up doesn't work. Even when Sonic and Tails confront Lyric in the past to set up the present events, which by the way, nice job stealing that plot point from Sonic 06 of all games, he doesn't even put up a fight. There's really not much else I could say about Lyric, honestly. He's a villain that, like Rise of Lyric as a whole, had potential, but the final result definitely could have been a lot better. Actually, wait, there's one more thing I want to add. What kind of name is Lyric? Of all the words you could have chosen for your villain's name, why something that relates to music for a villain that has nothing to do with music? I don't know, let's just move on. Even though my original worst video game villains list was the start of my count on making activities, so I'm obligated to thank it for that, I'm not even going to consider praising it for its actual quality. And probably one of the dumbest decisions I made on that list was with the number 1 candidate, that being Xdeath from Final Fantasy V. You want to know something you should never do in a countdown ever? Use a clip from someone else's video to do the talking for you. Regardless, it's been 5 years since that video now. I have a lot more experience under my belt, so now, with that in mind, it's time for me to properly elaborate in my own words on why Xdeath isn't really that bad. I mean, yes, personality-wise, he's as generic and non-subtle as you can get with a villain, which in any other game would probably suck. Except you gotta keep in mind the kind of game Final Fantasy V was. For the most part, it was lighter, more comical, and at times felt like a satire of RPGs, and this was especially shown with Xdeath's monologue and evil laughter motif. Plus, say what you will about personality, but in regards to actions, Xdeath actually gets a lot done. I mean, he's certainly not the greatest villain of the franchise, far from it, but I wouldn't call him the worst either. Especially in the same series that has a villain like Xande from Final Fantasy III. Now here we have the kind of villain that Xdeath's existence was meant to be a parody of in the first place. Probably the biggest problem with Xande as a villain is with the general structure of Final Fantasy III's story. This is a game that has so many subplots and new villains introduced in each subplot that the game never really has a chance to put a focus on a main villain. In fact, I'm honestly convinced that Xande was supposed to be just another subplot villain, but he was drawn out of a hat to be the main antagonist when the writers realized they needed some sort of finale. But even though they made Xande the main villain, they barely do anything with that. They drop his name a few times in the game and explain how he was a student of a powerful sage who went completely crazy after being granted the gift of mortality. Yes, gift, not curse. And no, the game doesn't explain why Xande's master gave him mortality as a gift, so thanks, writers. So because of this, Xande drained 2 of the 4 elemental crystals so that light and darkness would be out of balance and time would freeze. Don't ask me how that works. Allowing him to live forever as long as no one tried to kill him. Well, big surprise, draining 2 MacGuffins kinda screws up the world, so that does nothing but paint a giant target on his back for our heroes to go after. And when they finally meet him for the first time in the entire game, which keep in mind is in the dungeon right before the final dungeon, he fights them, dies, and then the game's true final boss, the Cloud of Darkness, appears out of nowhere as a result of the light and darkness imbalance and begins the final dungeon. So in other words, all Xande does for the entire game is cause the imbalance that gives the party a reason to go on their adventure, and that's literally it. And it's not like he has an interesting character to go along with it, Again, he's as generic as you can get, but unlike X-Death, this was supposed to be taken seriously. And the funniest part of all this to me is that I think even Square Enix wants to forget this villain exists. Why do I think this? Well, to put it simply, they resorted to using the game's out-of-nowhere final boss character as the villain representative of Final Fantasy III and Dissidia instead of Xande. You know, the character that the game built up as its main villain. If that doesn't prove my point, I don't know what will. That'd be like if Necron was playable in Dissidia instead of Kuja. Ugh, just think about that possibility, it honestly makes me cringe. You know, of all lists where I'd have my first opportunity to talk about the Uncharted series outside of talking about my excitement for Uncharted 4, I would have preferred it not to be on a list about crappy video game villains, let alone at the #1 spot. Oh well, we can't all be winners. As much as I've been enjoying the Uncharted games, I won't deny that its villains have definitely been one of the series' weaker elements. Granted, you should probably take this comment with a grain of salt since I'm still in the midst of Uncharted 2, and I have heard the villains get notably better by the end of the series, and I've seen enough of Uncharted 4 to know that that's the case with its main villain at the very least. But at the point I'm at in the series, the closest I've gotten to seeing a legitimate good villain is with Harry Flynn in Uncharted 2. With that in mind, it'd be safe to assume that I'd be talking about one of the villains from the first game for this, and sure enough, that I am. All three of Uncharted 1's villains suffer from the fatal disease of forgettability, a fate pretty much worse than death. But even though all three villains are beyond unmemorable, at the very least, Eddie Raja and Gabriel Roman both have connections to Nate and Sully, respectively, which adds at least a little bit of depth to them both. Though I very much mean a little bit. Like 10% at the absolute most. I guess that leaves only one other option now, does it? To those who don't know, this is Navarro, and I literally only remember that because I had to Google his name so much in order to find out some details about this guy. And sure enough, pretty much everything he's got going for him is present in-game, so in other words, pretty much nothing. He first appears in the game working under Gabriel Roman, who's out to find the fabled city of El Dorado because he likes treasure, with Navarro serving as Roman's tour guide since he somehow knows a lot about El Dorado. Even the fact that it's actually just a giant gold statue as opposed to a city. Not sure how he discovered this if the only record of this fact was long lost in the ocean until Nate found it at the start of the game, but whatever. However, once Roman and his men find the statue, Navarro tricks Roman into opening it and getting infected by the spores inside of it, turning him into a mutant like the ones Nate encountered earlier in the game. It's at this point that Navarro kills Roman and takes the role of main villain, revealing his plan to sell the spore-filled statue to the highest bidder as a biological weapon. So basically, Navarro's resorted to the I wanna be rich kind of villain. And again, no idea how Navarro knew about the spores in the statue if everyone who found out either got mutated or killed, but again, whatever. But hey, now that he's in the spotlight, maybe the game will take this opportunity to at least try to flesh him out a bit? He dies literally 10 minutes later. Good work, Naughty Dog. To put it simply, Navarro encapsulates exactly what happens when you need a villain in your story but you don't actually try with him. He's got a boring and unoriginal plan and they don't do anything to make it interesting, and he lacks so much character that his page on the Uncharted wiki literally doesn't have a personality section. Even Xande had one of those, albeit just a single sentence, and that's probably the saddest part about this guy. It's like I said earlier, forgettability is a fate worse than death. I'm the one-winged angel, and literally the only thing Naughty Dog had left that could possibly make Navarro a bit better by the end of the game was the boss fight against him. But somehow they couldn't even get that right. And I know, boss fights don't really come into play in the quality of a villain, but when a thing people remember the most about your villain is that the final battle against them is considered one of the worst bosses we've gotten in the last decade of gaming, you should probably reconsider your priorities a little bit. Alright, so before I roll the end card, there's a little something I want to say to all of you. Keep in mind that this video marks my 5-year anniversary for Countdown Making, so be prepared for some sap. Okay, here it goes. So I'm just gonna get straight to the point. Thank you all so much. When I first started making countdowns back in December of 2011, when I was still beyond inexperienced in making any kind of video really, I had no idea I would be doing them for so long. I had plenty of ideas, yes, but I thought it was a phase I was gonna fall out of in about a year's time. And yet, here we are, 5 years later, and I'm still doing them. Kind of. And honestly, I'm glad I've stuck through with it, as there's tons of things I would have never experienced if I didn't keep going. I wouldn't have played a lot of the games that are present in my gaming library and amongst my favorites. I wouldn't have met several people who I can safely call some of the best friends someone could ever have. And I wouldn't even thought of going to a gaming convention in Atlanta last May, which turned out to be one of the greatest weeks of my entire life. So yeah, it's been an eventful 5 years to say the least. And once again, I'd like to thank every single one of you for supporting what I do on this channel, whether it be leaving feedback in the comments, sending me personal messages about various things, or even just watching my content and subscribing. Every single one of you have played a part in getting me to where I am, and I can't thank you all enough for that. I'm honestly not sure where my channel is going to be going from here on out. I'll probably continue doing countdowns, dabble some more into video game review territory, maybe even get to streaming more often, but no matter what, I hope you guys continue to enjoy what I put out. It's been a fun 5 years, and here's to however many more this ends up going.